I was 69 years old when I discovered that everything I believed about my family was a lie. On what should have been the happiest night of my son's life, the rehearsal dinner before his wedding, I walked down a hotel corridor and opened a door that would shatter my entire world. What I saw in that room wasn't just betrayal. It was something so twisted, so carefully orchestrated, that when my son grabbed my arm and whispered those words, "Mom, I already knew, and it's worse than you think," I realized I'd been living inside a nightmare I didn't even know existed. For 42 years, I thought I knew my husband. I thought I understood my family. I thought the life we'd built in Boston was real. But that night, I learned that some secrets are so dark, so deeply buried, that when they finally surface, they don't just destroy a family. They reveal that the family was never real to begin with. What my husband had done wasn't just cruel. It was calculated, methodical, and so morally unthinkable that even now, telling you this story, I can barely believe it happened. This is the story of how I lost everything: my marriage, my reputation, my place in the world, and discovered that sometimes the only way to save the people you love is to burn down the life you've built together. It's a story about manipulation, control, and the devastating price of truce. But most of all, it's about what happens when a mother finally stops being silent. If you want to hear stories that will make you question everything you think you know about family, about loyalty, about the people sleeping next to you at night, then follow this channel. Leave a like if this story touched your heart, and comment below telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to tell you will stay with you long after the final words are spoken. I was 69 years old that cold November night in Boston when I saw something that shattered my entire world into 1,000 pieces. The kind of moment that splits your life into before and after, the kind that makes you question every single day you've lived, every choice you've made, every person you've trusted. The Fairmont Copley Plaza was glowing like a jewel box that evening. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the marble floors, and white roses, hundreds of them, filled every corner with their sweet, almost sickening perfume. The rehearsal dinner for my son Ethan's wedding was supposed to be perfect. I had spent months planning every detail, choosing the linens, tasting the wines, making sure everything would be flawless for my only child's special day. But as I sat there in that elegant ballroom, smoothing down my navy dress with trembling hands, I felt something crawling up my spine. A mother's intuition, perhaps. Or maybe just the cold recognition that something was terribly, horribly wrong. My husband, Richard, had disappeared almost 40 minutes earlier. He'd kissed my cheek, his lips dry and quick against my skin, and mumbled something about checking on last-minute arrangements with the hotel manager. I'd smiled and nodded, watching him walk away in his expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, looking every bit the successful attorney he'd always been. But 40 minutes had stretched into an hour, and the guests were starting to arrive. I could see Ethan standing near the entrance, greeting people with that forced smile he'd been wearing for weeks. My boy looked exhausted, his eyes carrying shadows that makeup couldn't hide. I'd asked him a dozen times if he was sure about this marriage, if Claire was really the one, and every time he'd just nodded and changed the subject. Claire, beautiful, perfect Claire, with her honey blonde hair and those striking green eyes that seemed to see right through you. She was 24, young enough to be my daughter, and she'd swept into our lives 2 years ago like a summer storm. Sudden, unexpected, and completely overwhelming. I pushed myself up from the velvet chair, my knees aching the way they always did when Boston turned cold. The ballroom was filling up now. Relatives from both sides, Ethan's college friends, colleagues from Richard's law firm. Everyone dressed in their finest, everyone smiling, everyone pretending that everything was absolutely wonderful. But where was Richard? I made my way through the crowd, nodding at faces I barely recognized, accepting air kisses from women who'd probably forgotten my name the moment they learned it. The ballroom led to a grand hallway with thick carpet that muffled my footsteps. I could hear distant music, the clink of glasses, laughter that seemed to come from another universe. The elevator took me to the second floor. where the hotel had reserved several suites for the wedding party. The corridor was dim, lit only by antique sconces that cast more shadows than light. My heart was pounding now, though I couldn't have told you why. Just that feeling, that terrible, certain feeling that something was about to crack open. That's when I saw it. A door, slightly ajar, room 237, and from inside I heard laughter, low, intimate laughter that I knew as well as my own heartbeat. Richard's laugh, the one he used to give me, back when we were young, back before life had worn us down into strangers who shared a bed and nothing else. My hand reached for the door before my mind could stop it. I pushed, and it swung open silently on well-oiled hinges. What I saw in that moment will haunt me until the day I die. The room was barely lit, just one lamp casting a golden glow across the rumpled bed. And there, tangled together like some obscene sculpture, were two people I thought I knew. My husband of 42 years, his shirt unbuttoned, his face flushed. And Claire, my son's bride-to-be, the girl who was supposed to marry Ethan in less than 48 hours, her white rehearsal dress hiked up around her thighs, her lipstick smeared across Richard's collar. Time stopped. My breath stopped. Everything stopped. Richard's head turned towards me, and for just a second, I saw something flash across his face. Not guilt, not shame, something darker, something that looked almost like satisfaction, as if he'd been waiting for this moment, as if he'd wanted me to find them. Claire gasped and scrambled to pull down her dress, but she didn't look surprised. She looked resigned, like this was just another scene in a play she'd been performing for far too long. I opened my mouth to scream, to rage, to tear that room apart with my bare hands. Every muscle in my body was coiled to explode, to unleash 42 years of swallowed words and buried resentments, and nights spent lying awake, wondering why my husband's side of the bed had grown so cold. But before I could make a sound, a hand gripped my arm, firm, strong, familiar. Ethan, my son, stood beside me in that hallway, his face pale as death, his eyes red and swollen, not with shock, but with something that looked like grief, old grief, the kind that had been festering for a while. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. "Don't do this. Not here. Not now." I tried to pull away, tried to push past him into that room, to confront the two people who had just destroyed everything I thought I knew about my life. But Ethan held on, his fingers digging into my arm with desperate strength. And then he leaned close to my ear and spoke words that turned my blood to ice. "Mom, I already knew. I've known for months. And it's so much worse than you think." The hallway tilted beneath my feet. Worse? How could anything be worse than this? How could there be something more devastating than watching your husband in the arms of your son's fiancée? But the look in Ethan's eyes told me everything I needed to know. There was more to this story, layers I hadn't seen, secrets buried so deep that even this horrific scene was just the surface. He pulled me away from that door, down the hallway, into a service stairwell that smelled of cleaning products and old carpet. I could barely breathe. My legs were shaking so badly I thought I might collapse right there on the concrete steps. "Ethan," I managed to choke out. "What are you talking about? What could possibly be worse than what I just saw?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw my little boy again. The child who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. The teenager who'd cried in my arms when his first girlfriend broke his heart. The young man who'd told me he was going to propose to Claire and asked for his grandmother's ring because he wanted to make me proud. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking, "Claire isn't just my fiancée. God, I don't even know how to say this." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. His hands were trembling so badly he could barely hold it. It looked old, yellowed with age, the edges worn as if it had been handled many times. "I found this 3 months ago," he whispered, "hidden in Dad's office. I wasn't even looking for anything. I was just trying to find the title to my car, and it fell out of a folder." He pressed the paper into my hands. I unfolded it slowly, my vision blurring with tears. I didn't even know I was crying. At first, the words didn't make sense. Medical terminology, laboratory results, dates from 12 years ago, and then I saw it, clear as day, bold letters across the top, paternity test results, Richard's name, and below it, another name, Claire Michelle Hartley, probability of paternity, 99.97%. The paper fell from my hands. I heard it hit the ground, but it seemed to come from very far away. My entire body had gone numb. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing, what I was being told. "She's his daughter," Ethan said, and his voice sounded like it was underwater. "My fiancée is my half-sister. Dad has a daughter he never told anyone about, and he brought her into our lives. He introduced us. He encouraged me to date her. He walked her into our home and let me fall in love with her, knowing exactly who she was. I couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't think. And tonight," Ethan continued, each word like a knife to my heart, "I came upstairs to tell him I couldn't go through with it, that I couldn't marry her, not after what I found out. But then I saw you heading up here, and I knew he'd arranged for you to find them. This is his way of making sure I stay quiet, of making sure we all stay quiet." The world was spinning. Nothing made sense anymore. My husband had a secret daughter. He'd hidden her for years, and then he'd brought her into our lives, let our son fall in love with her, and now he was using her to destroy us all. But why? Why would anyone do something so cruel, so calculated, so utterly monstrous? I looked up at my son, at the devastation written across his face, and I realized I was about to find out. Because whatever Richard had planned, whatever sick game he was playing, we were all pawns in it now. And the worst part? The absolute worst part that made me want to scream until my throat was raw? I'd been blind to it all. For years, I'd been living in a house built on lies, sleeping next to a man I didn't know, and now my son was paying the price for my willful ignorance. "Come on," Ethan said, guiding me down the stairs. "We need to get out of here before anyone sees us, before Dad realizes we know." But I couldn't move. My legs had turned to lead. All I could think about was that room, that scene, my husband, Claire, the lies, the secrets, the betrayal that went deeper than anything I could have imagined. "Mom," Ethan said urgently. "Mom, please. We have to go. There's more you need to know. So much more. And if we don't leave now, if we don't figure out what to do, this wedding is going to happen, and it will destroy all of us." I nodded, though I didn't fully understand what he meant. How could there be more? What else could there possibly be? But as we walked out of that hotel into the cold November night, as the wind cut through my dress and made me shiver uncontrollably, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My life as I knew it was over, and whatever came next was going to be worse than anything I'd ever faced before. Because in Boston, on that cold November night, I didn't just lose my marriage. I lost my faith in everything I'd ever believed about family, about loyalty, about love itself. And the story, the terrible, twisted story that was about to unfold, had only just begun. The drive back to my house felt like being trapped in a nightmare where everything moved in slow motion. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white, and I sat in the passenger seat staring out at the Boston streets. Streets I'd walked for 42 years, streets that suddenly felt foreign and hostile, as if the entire city had transformed into something I no longer recognized. The streetlights blurred past us in orange streaks. Thanksgiving decorations still hung in some windows, paper turkeys and autumn wreaths that seemed obscenely cheerful, given what I'd just witnessed. We'd just passed that nightmare only 3 days ago, gathering around a table and pretending to be a happy family, while my husband carved the turkey, and Claire sat beside Ethan, her hand resting on his with such practiced tenderness that I'd actually felt grateful she was going to be my daughter-in-law. Daughter-in-law. The words tasted like poison now. "Mom," Ethan said, breaking the suffocating silence that filled the car since we left the Fairmont. His voice was hoarse, raw, like he'd been screaming even though he'd barely spoken. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Can you do that?" I nodded, but I wasn't sure I could do anything carefully right now. My mind was spinning in circles, replaying that scene over and over. Richard's face, Claire's dress, that satisfied look in my husband's eyes that told me this wasn't just an affair. This was something calculated, something cruel. When I found that paternity test, Ethan continued, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I didn't believe it at first. I thought maybe it was old paperwork, maybe some case Dad had worked on. He's handled dozens of custody battles over the years. But then I looked at the date, and I looked at Claire's birthday, and everything just clicked into place. He turned onto Beacon Street, where our house sat among the other brick townhomes that wealthy Bostonians had called home for generations. The house where I'd raised Ethan, where I'd hosted dinner parties and Christmas celebrations, where I'd spent 42 years building what I thought was a life worth living. I confronted her first, Ethan said, pulling into our driveway but not turning off the engine. The headlights illuminated our front door. That red door I'd painted myself 5 years ago because I wanted our home to feel warm and welcoming. Now it just looked like a mouth ready to swallow me whole. 3 months ago, I showed her the test results and asked her if she knew. He paused, and I could see tears streaming down his face in the dim light from the dashboard. My son, my beautiful, kind son who'd never hurt anyone, who volunteered at soup kitchens and visited elderly neighbors, and always called me on Sundays just to ask how I was doing. She broke down, Mom, completely fell apart. Said she'd known for years. Said Dad found her when she was 18, right after her mother died. Told her who he was. Promised to help her, to give her money for college, to set her up with a good life. All she had to do was keep quiet about being his daughter. The engine hummed. I could smell the leather seats, the pine air freshener hanging from the rear-view mirror. Everything so normal, everything so utterly wrong. But that wasn't enough for him. Ethan continued, his voice rising with barely contained rage. He wanted insurance. He wanted to make sure she'd never expose him, never threaten his reputation, or his marriage, or his perfect little life. So he introduced us, engineered our meeting at that charity gala 2 years ago, made sure we'd sit next to each other, made sure we'd fall in love. I felt bile rising in my throat. That gala, I remembered it so clearly. Richard had insisted we all attend, said it was important for his firm's image, and I'd watched Ethan and Claire meet, watched them laugh together, watched them exchange numbers. I'd felt such joy that night, such hope that my lonely son had finally found someone who made him smile. He's been controlling her ever since, Ethan said, finally turning off the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, threatening to cut her off if she didn't go through with the wedding, reminding her that she has nothing, no family, no money of her own, no degree, because he made sure she dropped out of college to focus on our relationship. He's trapped her, Mom, just like he's trapped all of us. I turned to look at my son, really look at him, and saw the weight he'd been carrying. The sleepless nights I'd attributed to wedding stress, the way he'd stopped eating properly, the hollow look in his eyes that I'd convinced myself was just pre-marriage jitters. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Why didn't you come to me 3 months ago when you found out?" Ethan let out a bitter laugh that held no humor at all. "Because I was terrified, Mom. Terrified of what it would do to you. Terrified of destroying our family. And honestly, I didn't think you'd believe me. Dad's been so good at playing the perfect husband, the respected attorney, the pillar of the community. Who would believe that he'd do something this twisted?" He was right. Even now, even after everything I'd seen, part of me wanted to believe this was all some horrible misunderstanding, that there was an explanation that would make sense of the chaos, that would restore order to my shattered world. But tonight, Ethan said, reaching over to take my hand, I realized I couldn't let the wedding happen. I couldn't marry my own sister, Mom. I couldn't live that lie, no matter how much Dad threatened, no matter what he promised or what he said he'd destroy. So I went upstairs to tell him I was calling it off. And that's when you found me. I finished for him, the pieces finally starting to fit together in my fractured mind. "That's when I saw you heading up the stairs," he corrected. And I knew exactly what Dad was doing. He'd arranged for you to find them together. He wanted you to see it, Wanted you to be devastated and angry and ready to call off the wedding yourself. That way, he doesn't have to deal with my refusal. He can blame you, make you the villain, tell everyone that you ruined your son's happiness because of your own jealousy or paranoia or whatever story he decides to spin. The manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty. Richard had choreographed this entire nightmare, moving us all like pieces on a chessboard, anticipating every move, every reaction, every consequence. But why, I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Why go to such lengths? Why not just let Claire go, pay her off, send her away? Ethan's expression darkened. Because it's not about Claire, Mom. It's about control. It's about proving that he can do whatever he wants and get away with it. That he's smarter than all of us. That he owns us. We sat there in the driveway for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The house loomed before us. That red door now seeming less like a mouth and more like a wound, raw and bleeding and irreparable. What do we do now? I finally asked, though I felt like a child asking a parent for guidance, when it should have been the other way around. Ethan squeezed my hand, and I felt his fingers trembling against mine. Now, he said, now we have to decide if we're going to let him win, if we're going to stay silent and let him destroy us piece by piece, or if we're going to fight back. I looked at my son, this brave, broken young man who'd been carrying this terrible secret for months to protect me, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not hope exactly, but something harder, something sharper, rage, pure, clarifying rage at the man who'd stolen 42 years of my life, who'd turned my son's love into a weapon, who'd manipulated a young woman into becoming a pawn in his sick game. We fight, I whispered. But first, I need you to tell me everything, every detail, every piece of this puzzle, because if we're going to take him down, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Ethan nodded, and I saw relief flood his face. Relief that he wasn't alone anymore, that he didn't have to carry this burden by himself. We walked into that house together, into the home that no longer felt like mine, and I knew that everything was about to change. The wedding was in 2 days. The guests were arriving, the flowers were ordered, the cake was being decorated, and somehow, in 48 hours, we had to figure out how to stop a wedding, expose a monster, and save what was left of our shattered family. But as I closed that red door behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that Richard was somewhere out there, smiling to himself, confident that everything was going exactly according to his plan. He had no idea that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. He'd underestimated a mother's love and a mother's rage. 2 days passed before Ethan called me to his apartment in Cambridge, near the MIT campus where he worked as a research scientist. 2 days of barely eating, barely sleeping, barely breathing. I'd told Richard I was staying with my sister in Providence, a lie that came surprisingly easy after 42 years of what I now understood had been my own elaborate deception, pretending our marriage was real, pretending I didn't notice the distance, pretending I was happy. Richard hadn't even seemed concerned, just nodded and went back to his scotch and his laptop, probably calculating his next move in this twisted game he was playing with all our lives. Ethan's apartment was nothing like the house he'd grown up in. It was small, cluttered with scientific journals and half-empty coffee mugs, with windows that overlooked the Charles River where students rode even in late November, their breath visible in the freezing air. I'd always loved this place. It felt honest in a way our Beacon Street townhouse never had. When I arrived, Ethan looked like he hadn't slept either. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually neat brown hair stood up in different directions, like he'd been running his hands through it compulsively. He hugged me at the door, holding on longer than usual, and I could feel him shaking. "I've been organizing everything," he said, pulling away and gesturing to his dining table. "All the evidence, everything I found over the past 3 months." The table was covered in papers, photographs, printouts, and sticky notes with Ethan's neat handwriting connecting various pieces of information. It looked like something out of a crime drama, One of those investigation boards with red string connecting suspects and victims. Except this wasn't fiction. This was our life, laid bare in manila folders and highlighted documents. At the center of it all sat that leather portfolio I'd seen in the car, worn and cracked with age, the kind lawyers carried in the 80s. Richard's initials were embossed on the front in gold that had faded to a dull bronze. RTH, Richard Thomas Harrison. "Sit down, Mom," Ethan said gently, pulling out a chair for me. "This is going to take a while." My hands trembled as I lowered myself into the seat. The radiator clanked and hissed, pumping out heat that did nothing to warm the ice that had settled into my bones that night at the Fairmont. Ethan opened the portfolio with careful, almost reverent movements, like he was handling evidence in a murder trial. Maybe he was. Maybe this was a murder. The murder of everything I'd believed about my family, my marriage, my entire existence. "This is what I found first," he said, pulling out that paternity test I'd seen before. But now, in the light of his apartment, I could see details I'd missed in the stairwell. The laboratory's address, a private clinic in New York City, not Boston. The date, April 15, 2013. Claire would have been 12 years old. "He knew," I whispered, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. "He knew she was his daughter when she was just a child. He knew before she was born," Ethan corrected, pulling out another document. This one was older, yellowed with age, the paper thin enough to be almost translucent. A birth certificate. Claire Michelle Hartley, born June 3, 2001, in Portland, Maine. Mother, Jennifer Ann Hartley. Father, unknown. Unknown, I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. So he never acknowledged her, never put his name on official documents. He couldn't, Ethan explained, sitting down across from me. He was already married to you, already building his career. A legitimate daughter would have destroyed everything. His marriage, his reputation, his chances of making partner at the firm. He pulled out more papers, and I watched as he assembled them in chronological order, telling a story that made my stomach turn. Hospital bills from Jennifer Hartley's pregnancy, all paid in cash. Rental agreements for apartments in Portland, paid through an LLC that led back to Richard's firm. Canceled checks made out to Jennifer, marked as consulting fees, but dated regularly, monthly, like child support, hidden behind corporate terminology. He supported them financially, Ethan said, but only barely. Enough to keep Jennifer quiet, not enough for her to be comfortable. She worked 3 jobs, according to these tax returns I found. Waitress, house cleaner, night shift at a convenience store, all while raising Claire alone. I thought of my own life during those years. The trips to Europe Richard had taken me on, the renovation of our Beacon Street house, the BMW he'd bought me for my 50th birthday, all while his daughter and her mother struggled in Portland, barely making rent. Jennifer died 6 years ago, Ethan continued, his voice thick with emotion. Breast cancer. Stage 4 by the time they caught it, probably because she couldn't afford regular checkups. Claire was 18, just graduated from high school. No family, no money, no one. He pulled out a photograph and my breath caught in my throat. It showed a young Claire, younger than the polished woman I knew, her face rounder and softer, wearing a black dress that hung loose on her thin frame. She stood beside a simple casket in what looked like a municipal cemetery, completely alone. No other mourners, no flowers except for one small bouquet. The loneliness in that image was so profound, it physically hurt to look at. That's when Dad made contact, Ethan said. Showed up at the funeral, introduced himself, told her he was her father and that he wanted to help her. She thought it was a miracle, thought maybe something good could come from her mother's death. She had no idea what he was really planning. More documents emerged from the portfolio. A lease agreement for an apartment in Boston, co-signed by Richard. Tuition payments to Boston University, where Claire had enrolled as a freshman. Credit card statements showing purchases of clothes, textbooks, groceries, all the things a struggling student would need. He was grooming her, I said, the words making me feel sick. Establishing control, making her dependent on him. Exactly, Ethan confirmed. And then, in her sophomore year, he told her to drop out, said he'd found a better opportunity for her. a chance to work at his firm as a paralegal. She trusted him. Why wouldn't she? He was her father, and he'd been so generous, so kind. At least that's what she thought. The next document made my blood run cold. An employment contract with Richard's firm, but with clauses I'd never seen in any normal employment agreement. Confidentiality provisions that were unusually strict. Non-disclosure agreements that specifically mentioned family relationships and personal matters. Termination clauses that would forfeit not just her job but also her apartment, her health insurance, everything Richard had provided. He trapped her, I breathed. Legally trapped her. If she ever revealed she was his daughter, she'd lose everything. And it gets worse, Ethan said, pulling out his phone, because that's when he started introducing us. Look at these. He scrolled through photographs that I remembered from 2 years ago. That charity gala in November 2023, the one Richard had insisted we all attend. There was Ethan in his tuxedo, looking uncomfortable the way he always did at formal events. And there was Claire, stunning in a silver dress, her smile bright but somehow brittle. But now I noticed details I'd missed before. Richard in the background of several photos, watching them, positioning himself to facilitate conversations. Even one shot where he was clearly gesturing for Claire to sit next to Ethan at dinner. He orchestrated the whole thing, Ethan said, his voice shaking. Every meeting, every conversation. He suggested I invite her to coffee. Mentioned she liked the same movies I did. Told her I was single and lonely and could use someone to talk to. He manipulated both of us into falling in love. I looked at my son, saw the devastation on his face, and felt rage building in my chest like a physical force. What kind of monster did this? What kind of father used his own children, both of them, as pawns in some sick game? There's more, Ethan said, and I wanted to scream that there couldn't possibly be more, that I'd reached the limits of what a human heart could endure. But he pulled out another folder, this one thinner, containing only a handful of papers. These are emails, he explained, between Dad and someone named Marcus Chen, encrypted, but I managed to crack the password on Dad's laptop. He spread them out, and I read the printed exchanges with growing horror. Richard discussing Claire like she was property. Marcus, whoever he was, providing advice on how to maintain control and ensure compliance. References to the wedding as a contingency plan and insurance policy. Insurance against what? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Against her ever going public, Ethan said. Think about it, Mom. If Claire marries me, becomes part of our family officially, she can't expose Dad without also destroying me, without admitting she married her own half-brother, even if she didn't know it at first. She'd be ruined socially, legally, morally. Everyone would blame her. No one would believe she was a victim. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Richard had engineered a situation where Claire's silence was guaranteed not by legal contracts, but by something far more binding. Shame. The kind of shame that would follow her forever, that would make it impossible for her to speak out without destroying her own life. But he didn't count on me finding out, Ethan said, gathering up the papers. Didn't expect me to stumble across that paternity test. And now we know everything. Now we have all the evidence. The question is, what do we do with it? I looked at the table covered in documents, at the proof of Richard's manipulation and cruelty spanning nearly 25 years. I thought about Claire, trapped in this nightmare, about Ethan carrying this burden, about myself, blind and stupid for 4 decades. And I thought about that wedding, now only hours away, the guests arriving, the cake being delivered, the flowers arranged, everything proceeding exactly as Richard had planned. We expose him, I said, my voice steady for the first time in days. We take every piece of this evidence, and we burn his world to the ground. Ethan looked at me with something like hope flickering in his exhausted eyes. Are you sure? Once we do this, there's no going back. Our family will never be the same. I reached across the table and took his hand. Our family stopped being a family the moment your father decided to play God with all our lives. Now we take it back. The morning of what should have been the wedding rehearsal, I found myself standing outside St. Paul's Cathedral on Tremont Street. watching the early December snow dust the cobblestones with white powder that looked deceptively pure and innocent. My breath came out in clouds, and my fingers were numb inside my leather gloves, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Because inside that church, I knew Claire was there, going over last-minute details with the wedding coordinator. Ethan had given me her schedule. He still had access to the shared calendar they'd created when they first got engaged, back when everything seemed normal and hopeful, back when we were all still living inside Richard's carefully constructed lie. I'd told Ethan I needed to talk to her alone, to hear her side of this nightmare, to understand how much she knew, how complicit she was, how much of a victim she really was. He'd argued at first, worried that confronting her might alert Richard that we knew everything. But I'd insisted, because despite everything, despite the horror of what I'd seen at the Fairmont, I couldn't shake the image of that photograph. Young Claire standing alone at her mother's funeral, with no one in the world to hold her hand. The church door opened, and the wedding coordinator emerged. A short woman in her 50s with iron gray hair and a clipboard clutched to her chest like armor. She hurried past me toward the parking lot, muttering into her phone about table arrangements and floral centerpieces, completely oblivious to the fact that in less than 24 hours, none of it would matter. I slipped inside before the door closed completely. The cathedral was breathtaking in its silence. Stained glass windows filtered the weak winter sunlight into pools of red and blue and gold that danced across the stone floors. Candles flickered near the altar, their flames steady and hypnotic. Rows of wooden pews stretched toward the front where, tomorrow, Ethan should have been standing in his tuxedo, waiting for a bride who was actually his sister. Claire was alone at the altar, her back to me. She wore jeans and an oversized cream sweater that made her look younger than her 24 years, more vulnerable. Her blonde hair was pulled into a messy bun, and as I watched, she reached up to touch the white roses that had been arranged in massive displays on either side of where she would stand. Her hand trembled as she traced the petals. "They're beautiful," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the vast space. She spun around, and I saw the fear flash across her face before she schooled her features into something that resembled composure. But her eyes, those striking green eyes that I'd once thought would look lovely in family photos, were red-rimmed and swollen. "Evelyn," she breathed, and I noticed she didn't call me Mom the way she'd started to in recent months, testing out the word like she was trying it on for size. I didn't know you were coming today. Richard said you were still with your sister." "Richard says a lot of things," I replied, walking slowly down the center aisle toward her. My footsteps echoed in the quiet, each one deliberate, measured. Most of them are lies. Claire's face crumpled, and for a moment I thought she might cry. But instead, she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin in a gesture that reminded me painfully of Ethan when he was trying to be brave. "I suppose you want me to leave, to call off the wedding myself and disappear, save everyone the embarrassment. Is that what you think?" I asked, stopping a few feet away from her, close enough to see the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the way her hands were clenched so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "That I came here to chase you away? Isn't that what mothers do?" Her voice cracked on the last word. "Protect their sons from women like me? Women like you," I repeated slowly. "What kind of woman do you think you are, Claire?" She laughed, but it was a hollow, broken sound that seemed to get swallowed by the cathedral's vastness. "I'm the kind who sleeps with her fiancé's father, the kind who destroys families, the kind who—" Her voice broke completely, and she pressed her hand to her mouth like she was physically trying to hold back the words. I moved closer then, close enough to smell her perfume, something light and floral that I'd helped her pick out at Saks when we'd gone shopping together 3 months ago, back when I thought I was bonding with my future daughter-in-law, back when I had no idea she was already my husband's daughter. "You're the kind," I said quietly, "who was used, manipulated, trapped." Her eyes snapped to mine, wide with shock and something else, something that looked like desperate hope. You know?" "I know everything," I confirmed. "The paternity test, your mother, Portland, The apartment, the job, the contracts, all of it. Ethan found the evidence, and now we both know exactly what Richard has done. Claire's legs seemed to give out, and she sank onto the altar steps, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs that made her whole body tremble. I stood there, watching her fall apart, and felt my anger at her dissolve into something more complicated. Pity mixed with fury at Richard for doing this to a motherless girl who'd had no one to protect her. After a long moment, I sat down beside her on the cold stone steps. We sat in silence, two women who should have been family planning a wedding, instead sitting in the wreckage of a man's cruelty. "I didn't want any of this," Claire finally whispered, her voice so soft I had to lean closer to hear. "When he found me at my mother's funeral, I thought, God, I was so stupid. I thought maybe I could have a father. Maybe I wouldn't be alone anymore." "You weren't stupid," I said firmly. "You were grieving and vulnerable, and he took advantage of that." She lifted her head, and tears streamed down her face, carving tracks through the light makeup she wore. "But I should have known, should have seen what he was doing. He started talking about Ethan so casually, showing me photos, mentioning how lonely his son was. And when we met at that gala, it felt like fate, like maybe something good could come from all the bad, like maybe I could have a real family." Her voice broke on the word family, and I felt my own tears threatening, because I understood. God help me. I understood what it was like to want to believe in something good so desperately that you ignored all the warning signs. "When did you realize?" I asked. "When did you figure out what Richard was really doing?" Claire wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater, a childish gesture that made her look even younger. "Not until after Ethan proposed. Richard called me to his office, said he wanted to celebrate, wanted to give me a gift. He handed me an envelope. Inside was a copy of the paternity test, just sitting there, no explanation, no warning, just proof that I was marrying my own brother." I closed my eyes, imagining that moment, the horror, the realization, the trap snapping shut. "I confronted him," Claire continued, her voice gaining strength as anger bled through the tears. "Screamed at him, asked him how he could do this. And you know what he said?" She turned to look at me, and the bitterness in her eyes was like looking in a mirror. He said, "Now you'll never tell anyone who you really are, because if you do, you'll destroy not just me, but Ethan too. You'll ruin an innocent man's life. Could you live with that?" The manipulation was so elegant, so perfectly calculated. Richard had turned Claire's love for Ethan into a weapon against both of them. "I wanted to run," she whispered. "Wanted to disappear. But he showed me the contracts, reminded me that I had nothing. No degree, no job skills, no savings. Everything I had, he'd given me, and he could take it all away with one phone call. Plus, he said that if I broke Ethan's heart by leaving, he'd make sure Ethan knew exactly why. Make sure everyone knew. Make sure I was branded as some kind of monster who seduced her own brother." "So you stayed," I said. "So I stayed," she echoed. "And I tried to figure out a way to tell Ethan without destroying him. But every time I got close, Richard would remind me of what was at stake, would show up at my apartment with another contract to sign, another way to bind me tighter. And then, that night at the Fairmont," she trailed off, and I saw her face flush with shame. "He told me to meet him there," she said, her voice barely audible. "Said he had documents I needed to sign before the wedding, legal things. When I got to that room, he had drinks poured, and he kept talking about how this was all going to work out perfectly, how I was playing my part so well. And then he started touching me, and I tried to push him away, but he said," her voice broke completely. "He said if I didn't cooperate, he'd tell Ethan everything himself, right before the wedding, in the most humiliating way possible." Rage flooded through me so intensely that I had to grip the edge of the stone step to keep myself steady. Richard hadn't just manipulated and controlled her. He'd assaulted her, used her body as another tool in his sick game. "I hated myself," Claire whispered. "Hated that I was so weak, so trapped. And then you walked in, and I saw your face, and I thought, finally, Finally, someone will stop this. Someone will save me. She turned to me then, her green eyes pleading. But Ethan stopped you, and I didn't understand why. Why would he protect his father? Why would he let this continue? Because he already knew, I told her gently. He'd known for months. Found the paternity test in Richard's office. He was trying to figure out how to stop the wedding without destroying you. Fresh tears spilled down Claire's cheeks. He knew. This whole time he knew, and he still treated me with kindness? Still looked at me like I was someone worth loving? That's who my son is, I said, feeling my own tears finally fall. That's who he's always been. We sat there together on those altar steps. Two women who'd been turned into casualties in Richard's war against decency. The candles flickered. The stained glass windows painted us in sacred colors. And outside, the snow continued to fall on a city that had no idea what was about to unfold. What happens now? Claire asked finally. The wedding is tomorrow. Everyone's arriving. Richard thinks everything is going according to his plan. I stood up, brushing off my coat, and offered her my hand. She looked at it for a long moment before taking it, letting me pull her to her feet. Now, I said, we make sure Richard Harrison learns that you don't use people's pain as currency, that you don't destroy lives for sport, that eventually, every monster faces consequences. How? Claire asked, and I could hear both hope and terror in her voice. I squeezed her hand. Tomorrow, at that altar, in front of everyone he respects and everyone who thinks he's such a good man, we tell the truth, all of it, and we watch his perfect world burn. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went home to confront Richard, not to scream or cry or beg for explanations, but to look him in the eye and let him know that I knew, that the game he'd been playing so masterfully for decades was finally over. The house on Beacon Street was lit up when I arrived just after 9 o'clock. Through the front windows, I could see Richard in his study, the room where he'd spent countless nights working on cases, building his reputation as one of Boston's most respected attorneys. How many nights had I brought him coffee or scotch, kissed the top of his head, told him not to work too hard? How many times had I played the dutiful wife while he sat in that leather chair, probably plotting his next move in this sick chess game he was playing with all our lives? I let myself in quietly. The house smelled like the cinnamon candles I'd lit that morning, a lifetime ago, when I was still a woman who cared about things like seasonal scents and holiday decorations. The Christmas tree I'd put up the week before stood in the living room, its lights twinkling cheerfully, mocking me with their false promise of joy and family togetherness. Richard didn't hear me approach his study. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see him on the phone, his voice low and controlled in that way he used when discussing legal strategy. I pushed the door open and stood in the doorway waiting. He looked up, saw me, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or calculation, before he schooled his features into that pleasant mask he wore so well. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone, then set it down on his mahogany desk, the same desk where he'd probably hidden all those documents about Claire, about Portland, about his double life. "Evelyn," he said, standing up with that politician's smile he'd perfected over the years. "I thought you were staying with Margaret until after the wedding. Is everything all right?" I stepped into the room, closing the door behind me. The click of the latch sounded final, like sealing a tomb. "Everything's all right," I repeated, and I was almost proud of how steady my voice sounded. "That's what you're going to ask me, after what I saw at the Fairmont." His smile didn't falter, but I saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Ah," he said, sitting back down in his chair, completely at ease, like we were discussing the weather. "So you did see. I wasn't certain if you'd actually made it to the room before Ethan intercepted you." The casualness of his admission hit me like a slap. No denial, no shame, no pretense of remorse. "You wanted me to see," I said, the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. "You arranged for me to find you with Claire, timed it perfectly, made sure I'd walk in at exactly the right moment." Richard leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in front of him. a gesture I'd seen him use in court when he was about to deliver a devastating blow to the opposing counsel. "You always were perceptive, Evelyn. It's one of the things I appreciated about you. Not intelligent enough to be truly dangerous, but perceptive enough to be useful." The insult was delivered so smoothly, so matter-of-factly, that for a moment I couldn't even process it. 42 years of marriage, and this was how he saw me. Useful, but not dangerous. "Why?" I asked, moving closer to his desk. "Why orchestrate something so cruel? What could you possibly gain from making me watch that?" He sighed like I was a student who disappointed him by asking an obvious question. "Because, my dear, I needed the wedding called off. Ethan was getting cold feet. I could see it in the way he'd been avoiding me, the questions he'd been asking. I suspected he might have found something, might know more than he should. And if he called off the wedding himself, Claire might feel freed from her obligations, might decide to tell her sad little story to someone who'd listen." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Beacon Street, where snow was beginning to accumulate on the parked cars. "But if you discovered the affair and demanded the wedding be cancelled in a fit of maternal rage and jealousy, well, that changes everything. Claire stays silent to avoid being blamed for destroying a family. Ethan stays silent to protect you from embarrassment. And I?" He turned back to me with a smile that made my skin crawl. "I get to play the repentant husband, the man who made a terrible mistake but is willing to work on his marriage. My reputation stays intact. The calculation behind it all was breathtaking in its cruelty. Every move planned, every reaction anticipated, every person reduced to a playing piece." "She's your daughter," I said, my voice shaking now with rage I could barely contain. "Claire is your daughter, Richard, and you brought her into our home, manipulated our son into falling in love with her, and then used her body to control them both. What kind of monster does that?" For the first time, his mask slipped. His eyes went cold, not angry, but empty, like looking into a well with no bottom. "Monster?" he repeated softly. "I prefer to think of myself as pragmatic." Claire was a problem that needed managing. Her mother was careless enough to get pregnant despite our arrangement. I paid for her silence for 18 years, but when Jennifer died, the girl became a liability. She could have come forward at any time, demanded recognition, destroyed everything I'd built. He walked back to his desk, poured himself 2 fingers of scotch from the crystal decanter I'd given him for our 30th anniversary. He didn't offer me any, so I brought her here, gave her a life, made her dependent on me, and then I gave her something she wanted even more than money or stability. I gave her a family, a brother who loved her, a mother figure, belonging, and in exchange, she gave me her silence. "And Ethan?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What about your son? What about making him fall in love with his own sister?" Richard shrugged. Actually shrugged like we were discussing something as trivial as furniture placement. "Ethan is soft. Always has been. Too much of you in him, not enough of me. He needed someone to take care of, someone to rescue. Claire was perfect for that role. And if things had gone according to plan, they'd have had a perfectly adequate marriage, neither of them knowing the truth, both of them bound by secrets that would keep my past buried forever." He took a sip of his scotch, savoring it like he savored his own cleverness. "The only variable I didn't anticipate was Ethan's curiosity, his tendency to snoop where he shouldn't. That was sloppy of me. Leaving that test where he could find it, I'm usually more careful. I stared at this man I'd shared a bed with for over 4 decades, and I realized I had never known him at all. The Richard I'd married, or thought I'd married, had been a fiction, a character he'd played to achieve his goals. This cold, calculating creature in front of me was the real man, and he'd been hiding in plain sight all along. "You won't get away with this," I said, though my voice lacked the conviction I wanted it to have. He smiled again, that politician's smile. "But I already have, Evelyn. I've been getting away with it for 24 years. Every affair, every lie, every manipulation, all of it hidden behind the mask of respectability. And you know what the beautiful thing is." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with something that looked like triumph. "Even now, with you knowing everything, you won't tell. Because if you do, You destroy Ethan. You admit to the world that your son almost married his sister. You make your family the subject of gossip and disgust. You turn your life into a scandal that will follow you until you die. He was right. God help me, he was right. That's what made his plan so perfect. The truth was too devastating to speak aloud. The shame of it would cling to all of us, but especially to Ethan and Claire, two innocent people who'd been nothing more than pawns in Richard's game. And that's why you'll do exactly what I expect. Richard continued, his voice smooth as poisoned honey. You'll help me convince Ethan that calling off the wedding quietly is the best option. You'll support whatever story we create to explain the cancellation. You'll stay married to me because divorce would raise too many questions. And most importantly, you'll keep your mouth shut because speaking up would destroy the one thing you care about more than yourself, your son. He moved toward me then, close enough that I could smell the scotch on his breath, see the absolute certainty in his eyes. I own you, Evelyn. I own all of you, and there's not a damn thing any of you can do about it. In that moment, standing in that study with my husband's words hanging in the air like poison gas, I made a decision. Maybe it was the wrong decision. Maybe it would destroy everything. But I wouldn't let him win. Not like this. Not after everything he'd done. You're right about one thing, I said quietly, stepping back from him. The truth would destroy us. It would be devastating and horrible and impossible to recover from. I saw the satisfaction flicker across his face, saw him think he'd won. You know what's worse than being destroyed by the truth? I continued, my voice growing stronger with every word. Living with your lies, letting you continue to use people like they're nothing more than tools for your ambition. Watching you sit in that chair, drinking your expensive scotch, convinced that you're so much smarter than everyone else that you're untouchable. I turned toward the door, my hand on the handle. Tomorrow at that church, in front of everyone you've spent decades impressing, we're going to tell the truth. All of it. And yes, it will destroy us, but it will destroy you most of all. Because the one thing you care about, your precious reputation, your respectability, your position in this city, all of that will burn, and I'll get to watch. I opened the door and looked back at him one last time. His face had gone pale, the scotch glass frozen halfway to his lips. You miscalculated, Richard. You thought we'd choose silence over scandal, but you forgot that some things are worth losing everything for, and stopping you is one of them. I walked out of that study, out of that house, and I didn't look back. The morning of December 7th dawned cold and crystalline, the kind of perfect winter day that makes Boston look like something out of a Currier and Ives painting. The sky was that brilliant blue that only comes after fresh snow, and the sun glinted off the white-covered streets with almost painful brightness. It should have been the most beautiful day of my son's life. Instead, it was the day we chose to detonate a bomb that would destroy everything. St. Paul's Cathedral was packed by 11 o'clock. 200 guests filled the pews. Richard's colleagues from the law firm in their expensive suits. Distant relatives I'd seen maybe twice in 40 years. Ethan's friends from MIT and grad school. Claire's co-workers from Richard's office, who had no idea they'd been working alongside the boss's secret daughter. Everyone dressed in their finest, everyone chattering excitedly, everyone completely oblivious to what was about to happen. I sat in the front pew on the right side, the mother of the groom's traditional seat, wearing a navy dress I'd bought specifically for this occasion. My hands were folded in my lap, and to anyone watching, I probably looked like a proud mother waiting for her son's wedding to begin. Only I knew that my hands were folded so tightly because if I relaxed them, they would shake uncontrollably. Richard sat beside me, playing his part perfectly. He'd even reached over to pat my hand at one point, a gesture of husbandly affection that made my skin crawl. He thought I'd back down, thought my threat last night had been empty words from an emotional woman who'd ultimately choose silence over scandal. He'd called Ethan this morning, I'd learned, suggesting they meet for breakfast to discuss options. Ethan had declined. The organist began playing Pachelbel's canon in D, the signal that the ceremony was about to start. A hush fell over the crowd, that anticipatory silence that comes before weddings and births and other moments people think of as sacred. Ethan appeared from the side door, walking toward the altar with steps that looked steady, but that I knew from 3 decades of being his mother were anything but. He wore a charcoal gray tuxedo that made him look older than his 32 years. His face was pale, his jaw set in that determined way he'd had since he was a little boy, refusing to give up on a difficult math problem. He reached the altar and turned to face the crowd, and I saw him search for my face in the sea of guests. Our eyes met, and I gave him the smallest nod. We're doing this. We're really doing this. The back doors of the cathedral opened, and Claire appeared in a dress that had cost $8,000 and 3 months of fittings. It was ivory silk with delicate lace sleeves, the kind of dress every bride dreams of. She looked beautiful and terrified, her face half hidden behind a veil that did nothing to disguise her trembling hands clutching a bouquet of white roses. The organist began the wedding march, and Claire started her walk down the aisle, alone, because Richard, who should have been walking her down the aisle as the father of the groom, was sitting in the pew beside me, completely unaware that his daughter was approaching the altar, where she would expose him to everyone who'd ever respected him. Halfway down the aisle, Claire stopped walking, just stopped, her feet rooted to the floor, her bouquet shaking in her hands. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Was she having second thoughts? Was this normal wedding jitters? Ethan descended the altar steps and walked toward her, meeting her in the middle of the aisle. He said something to her that I couldn't hear, but I saw her nod, saw her straighten her shoulders. He took her hand, and together they walked back to the altar. Father Murphy, the elderly priest who'd baptized Ethan 32 years ago, smiled benevolently at them. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying through the cathedral with practiced ease. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Ethan Thomas Harrison and Claire Michelle Hartley in holy matrimony." "Stop!" Ethan's voice cut through the priest's words like a knife through silk. "I'm sorry, Father Murphy, but I can't do this." The silence that fell over the cathedral was absolute. 200 people holding their breath simultaneously. Father Murphy's smile froze on his face, confusion replacing his benevolent expression. "Ethan," he said gently. "Son, it's natural to be nervous." "This isn't nervousness," Ethan interrupted, his voice growing stronger. "This is me standing in front of everyone who matters to my family and telling the truth. A truth that's been buried for 24 years. A truth that my father—" He turned to look directly at Richard, whose face had gone from pale to red, "has been hiding through manipulation, threats, and abuse." I felt Richard tense beside me, felt him prepare to stand, to intervene. I reached over and gripped his arm with strength I didn't know I possessed, my fingernails digging through his expensive suit jacket. "Sit," I hissed. "For once in your life, you're going to sit here and face the consequences of what you've done." Claire stepped forward then, her voice soft but audible in the perfect acoustics of the cathedral. "My name is Claire Michelle Hartley," she said, pulling back her veil with shaking hands. "And I'm not just Ethan's fiancée. I'm his half-sister. Richard Harrison is my biological father." The gasps that erupted from the crowd sounded like a wave crashing. People half stood from their seats, then sat back down, uncertain what to do with this information. Someone's phone clattered to the floor. A woman in the back let out a small scream that she quickly smothered. 24 years ago, Ethan continued, his voice cutting through the chaos, "my father had an affair with a woman named Jennifer Hartley in Portland, Maine. When she became pregnant with Claire, he paid her to keep quiet, supported them financially, but never acknowledged his daughter. When Claire's mother died 6 years ago, leaving her alone and vulnerable at 18 years old, he found her at the funeral and brought her here to Boston." Richard tried to stand again, but I held him down with surprising force, my own voice joining the revelation. He manipulated her, controlled her, made her dependent on him, and then, my voice broke, but I pushed through. He introduced her to Ethan, orchestrated their relationship, let them fall in love knowing exactly who Claire was, knowing that if they married, Claire would be bound to silence by shame and family obligation. The crowd was no longer gasping. They were in full uproar. Richard's law partners were standing shouting questions. Relatives were crying. Ethan's friends looked like they'd been punched in the stomach. Father Murphy had backed away from the altar, his face ashen, one hand clutching the crucifix around his neck. "These are lies!" Richard finally found his voice, wrenching his arm free from my grip and standing. His face was purple now, veins standing out on his forehead. "My son is having a breakdown. The stress of the wedding—" "Is this a lie?" Ethan pulled a folder from inside his jacket, that leather portfolio with Richard's initials embossed in fading gold. He held up the paternity test, the pages visible even from where I sat. "Is the DNA test a lie? The birth certificate, the financial records showing years of payments to Jennifer Hartley, the employment contracts you made Claire sign that bound her to silence?" He walked down from the altar into the center aisle where everyone could see him clearly. "My father is not who you think he is. He's not the respected attorney, the pillar of the community, the man who gives speeches about ethics and justice. He's a manipulator who uses people's vulnerabilities against them, who controls through fear and dependency, who was willing to let me marry my own sister to protect his reputation." Claire joined him in the aisle, her wedding dress rustling as she moved. "He assaulted me," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "2 days ago, at the Fairmont Hotel. Forced himself on me and said if I didn't cooperate, he'd destroy what little life I'd managed to build. And when Evelyn walked in and saw us, that wasn't an accident. He arranged it, timed it perfectly, because he wanted her to demand the wedding be canceled so that we'd all be trapped by our shame into staying silent." The crowd was beyond shock now. They were horrified, disgusted, angry. I could see Richard's partners conferring urgently, probably already calculating how to distance the firm from the scandal. I could see relatives gathering their belongings, preparing to leave before they could be associated with this disaster. I could see Ethan's friends moving toward him, flanking him in silent support. "You have no proof!" Richard shouted, but his voice had lost its authority. He sounded desperate now, cornered. "This is all lies and manipulation by a disturbed young woman and a son who— We have all the proof!" I stood then, joining Ethan and Claire in that center aisle, creating a united front. "Every document, every contract, every piece of evidence of what you've done. And if anyone here doubts what we're saying, we'll provide it all. To the police, to the Bar Association, to every newspaper in Boston. You wanted to protect your reputation, Richard. You wanted to maintain your perfect image. Well, congratulations. You've just become the most notorious man in Boston." The cathedral erupted. People were shouting, crying, demanding explanations. Richard's face had gone from purple to a sickly gray. He looked around wildly, seeing his carefully constructed world crumbling around him, seeing 40 years of reputation, management destroyed in 15 minutes. And then, in the chaos and noise and devastation, he did something I never expected. He ran, pushed through the crowd, and fled down the side aisle toward the exit, his expensive shoes slipping on the polished floor, his dignity shredded beyond repair. No one stopped him. We all just watched him go. This man who'd spent decades believing he was untouchable, finally facing the consequences he'd evaded for so long. Ethan turned to the crowd, many of whom were still staring in shock. "I'm sorry you had to witness this. I'm sorry your day was ruined. But we couldn't live with the silence anymore. We couldn't let him continue to hurt people. Sometimes the truth is devastating, but it's still better than the alternative." He looked at Claire, then at me, and I saw tears streaming down his face. Not tears of sadness, but of relief, of freedom. We'd done it. We'd told the truth. And yes, we'd destroyed everything. But at least now, finally, we could begin to rebuild on something real. The weeks following what Boston newspapers gleefully dubbed the cathedral scandal were the darkest of my entire life, and I'd lived through plenty of dark times. My mother's slow death from Alzheimer's, the miscarriages before Ethan was finally born, the quiet loneliness of a marriage that had died years before. I realized it was over, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for the aftermath of telling the truth. The story exploded across Boston like a wildfire in August, It wasn't just the local papers, the Globe, the Herald, that picked it up. Within 48 hours, it had gone national. CNN ran a segment. The New York Times published an op-ed about power, abuse, and complicity. Social media tore us apart with a viciousness that took my breath away. We were trending on Twitter for 3 solid days, our names attached to hashtags I couldn't bear to read. But worse than the media circus, worse than the strangest judgments, was watching what it did to the people I loved. I moved out of the Beacon Street house the day after the wedding that never was. Couldn't bear to spend another night in those rooms that had witnessed 42 years of lies. I took only what I could fit in 2 suitcases. Some clothes, a few photographs of Ethan as a child, my mother's jewelry box. Everything else I left behind, like shedding a skin that had never really fit. I found a small apartment in Cambridge, near Central Square, in a neighborhood where nobody knew me and nobody cared about Boston society scandals. It was on the 3rd floor of a walk-up with radiators that clanked all night, and neighbors I could hear through the thin walls. After decades of marble countertops and crown molding, and rooms big enough to echo, the smallness of it should have felt suffocating. Instead, it felt like freedom, or maybe just like the punishment I deserved for being blind for so long. The first week, I barely left the apartment. I'd stand at the window watching students hurry past on their way to classes, normal people living normal lives, and I'd feel like I was watching them from another planet. My phone rang constantly. Reporters, acquaintances pretending to offer support while clearly fishing for gossip. Richard's lawyer with papers to sign. I stopped answering after the first day. Ethan came to see me on the 5th day. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, slower than they should have been, heavier, and I knew even before I opened the door that something was terribly wrong. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 5 days. His face was gaunt, dark circles so deep they looked like bruises shadowing his eyes. He'd lost weight. I could see it in the way his sweater hung loose on his frame. But worst of all was the emptiness in his expression, like someone had reached inside and scooped out everything that made him Ethan. "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked on that single word. I pulled him inside and wrapped my arms around him, feeling him shake against me. He was so thin. When had he gotten so thin? He'd always been slender, but now I could feel his ribs through the sweater, could feel how fragile he'd become. "Have you been eating?" I asked, already knowing the answer. He shook his head against my shoulder. "Can't. Every time I try, I see their faces. Everyone at the cathedral, the way they looked at me, at us, like we were something dirty, something disgusting." I guided him to the small couch I'd bought at Goodwill. Gray fabric worn smooth by previous owners, but clean and comfortable enough. He collapsed onto it like his strings had been cut, and I saw how his hands trembled as he pressed them against his face. "MIT put me on leave," he said, his voice muffled. "Called it administrative leave pending review, but we both know what that means. They don't want someone involved in a scandal teaching their students. My research partner requested a transfer to a different project. Said she couldn't work with someone who had such poor judgment." Each word was a knife to my heart. This was my fault. I'd pushed for the truth, insisted we expose Richard, and now my son was paying the price. "The guys from my lab won't return my calls," he continued, and I could hear tears in his voice now. "My thesis advisor, Professor Chen, who I've worked with for 6 years, sent me an email saying he thought it would be best for everyone if I found a new advisor. Everyone's dropping me like I'm contagious." "Oh, baby," I whispered, the old endearment from when he was small slipping out before I could stop it. "I'm so sorry. This is my fault. I pushed for this. I insisted we tell the truth, and now, no." He lifted his head, and his eyes were red and swollen but fierce. "No, Mom, this isn't your fault. None of this is your fault. It's his. It's all Dad. He created this situation. He's the one who should be losing everything, not us." But the terrible thing was, Richard wasn't losing everything. Oh, he'd been forced to resign from his law firm. His partners had made that clear within hours of the scandal breaking. But he'd left with his full pension. with his retirement accounts intact, with a severance package that probably rivaled the GDP of a small country. He'd hired the best crisis management team in Boston, people who were already working to reshape the narrative, to paint him as a man who'd made mistakes, but who'd tried to make amends, who'd been vilified by an unstable ex-wife and a disturbed son. I'd seen the interview he'd given to Boston Magazine, carefully choreographed sympathy oozing from every word. "I deeply regret the pain my actions have caused," he'd said, looking directly into the camera, with those sincere eyes he'd perfected over decades of lying. "I made mistakes in my youth that I've spent years trying to rectify privately. I never wanted these private family matters to become public, but I understand why my son felt he needed to share his truth. His truth. Like Ethan had made it all up, like the DNA test and the contracts and the evidence were just one person's interpretation of events rather than documented proof of decades of manipulation. He's already rebuilding," Ethan said bitterly, echoing my thoughts. "I saw him at Salty Girl last week, having lunch with some tech CEO, laughing, shaking hands, like nothing happened. Meanwhile, I can't walk down the street without people staring at me, whispering." I thought about my own experiences over the past week. The neighbor who'd crossed to the other side of the street when she saw me coming. The cashier at the grocery store whose name tag said Brenda, and who'd looked at me with such disgust as she scanned my items that I'd left half my groceries on the counter and fled. The women from my book club who'd sent a group email, not even individual messages, saying they thought it would be best if I didn't attend anymore. 42 years of friendships evaporated like morning fog. People I'd thought loved me revealing that their affection had always been conditional, contingent on my place in Boston society, my marriage to Richard, my role as the respectable wife of a respectable man. "Claire's gone," Ethan said suddenly, and the pain in his voice was so raw it made me flinch. "She left Boston 3 days ago, sent me a text saying she couldn't stay here, couldn't face the judgment, couldn't handle people calling her things I won't repeat." "Where did she go?" I asked, though I wasn't sure it mattered. "Portland, back to where she grew up. She said she's staying with an old friend of her mother's. Said she needs time to figure out who she is when she's not being controlled by Dad or defined by the scandal." He wiped his eyes roughly with his sleeve. "I wanted to go with her, to help, but she said I was part of what she needed to get away from. That every time she looks at me, she sees what we almost did, what Dad made us almost do." The devastation in his voice broke something inside me. This beautiful love they'd had, genuine, real, before they'd known the truth, had been poisoned beyond repair. Even though they were innocent, even though they'd been victims, the shame of it would follow them forever. "I dream about it," Ethan whispered. "Every night. I dreamed that I didn't find the paternity test, that the wedding happened, that we—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but I understood. The nightmares of what could have been if he hadn't stumbled across that hidden document were eating him alive. We sat in silence for a long time, mother and son in a tiny apartment that smelled like other people's cooking from the floors below. The radiator clanked. Somewhere a baby cried. Outside, the city continued its normal rhythm, completely indifferent to our suffering. "I don't know how to come back from this," Ethan finally said. "I don't know how to rebuild a life when everyone thinks I'm either a monster or a victim, or just pathetically stupid for not seeing what Dad was doing. I don't know how to be Ethan Harrison when that name is now synonymous with the worst scandal Boston's seen in years." I took his hand, and it felt so small and cold in mine. "I don't know either," I admitted. "I wake up every morning, and for about 5 seconds everything's normal. And then I remember, and it's like drowning all over again every single day." "Was it worth it?" he asked, looking at me with those eyes that used to be so full of curiosity and hope and now just looked empty. Telling the truth? Exposing him? Was it worth losing everything? I wanted to say yes. Wanted to tell him that justice and truth were worth any price, that we'd done the right thing, that eventually people would understand. But looking at my son, brilliant, kind, destroyed, I couldn't make myself say the words. "I don't know," I whispered. "Ask me again in a year." But even as I said it, I wondered if in a year We'd even still be alive. Not physically dead, maybe, but dead in all the ways that mattered. Dead to society, dead to our old lives, dead to the people we used to be. Ethan stayed with me that night, sleeping on my couch because I couldn't bear to let him go back to his empty apartment, where I knew he'd sit in the dark and stare at nothing. I lay awake in my bedroom, listening to him crying softly in the next room, and I thought, this is rock bottom. This is what the truth costs. This is the price of exposing a monster who knows how to play the victim better than his actual victims ever could. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, was that I still didn't regret it. Even drowning in the consequences, even watching my son fall apart, I couldn't bring myself to wish we'd stayed silent, because silence had its own cost, and we'd all been paying it for far too long. Spring came to Boston the way it always did, reluctantly, with false starts and unexpected snow flurries even in April. But eventually the ice melted from the Charles River, the magnolia trees in the public garden burst into pink blooms, and the world insisted on renewal whether we were ready for it or not. It had been 5 months since the cathedral, 5 months that felt like 5 years, like 5 lifetimes. The media had finally moved on to newer scandals, a congressman's affair, a corporate embezzlement case, and our names faded from headlines and Twitter trends. But the damage lingered like radiation, invisible but persistent, poisoning everything it touched. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in late April, slipped under my apartment door sometime during the night. My name was written on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. Feminine, careful, each letter precisely formed. No return address, just Evelyn Harrison in black ink. I almost threw it away. I'd received enough hate mail in the first 2 months after the scandal that I'd stopped opening anything without a clear sender. Death threats, mostly. People telling me I was going to hell for destroying my family. One particularly creative soul had sent me a children's book about the importance of keeping family secrets, with certain passages highlighted in yellow. But something made me open this one. Maybe the gentleness of the handwriting. Maybe just the exhaustion of being afraid of everything. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, and a photograph. I looked at the photo first. It showed Claire, thinner than I remembered, standing in front of a small house with peeling white paint. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt, her honey blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she was smiling. Not the polished, practiced smile I'd seen at family dinners and engagement parties. A real smile. Small, tentative, but genuine. My hands shook as I unfolded the letter. "Dear Evelyn," it began, and I had to sit down on my threadbare couch because my legs suddenly wouldn't hold me. I've started this letter 100 times over the past 5 months. I've written versions where I'm angry, versions where I'm apologetic, versions where I try to explain what these months have been like. But the truth is, there are no words adequate for what we've all been through. No way to capture the devastation and the relief and the shame and the freedom all tangled together like roots that can't be separated. I'm writing to you from Portland, from a small house 3 blocks from where I grew up. Remember me mentioning Mrs. Patterson at the cathedral? My mother's friend? She took me in when I had nowhere else to go, when Boston became unbearable. She's 73 now, a widow, and she needed someone to help with her garden and grocery shopping. I needed someone who didn't know about the scandal, who could look at me without seeing the headlines. For the first month, I barely spoke. I'd help Mrs. Patterson with her daily routines, cook simple meals, pull weeds from her flower beds, and then I'd go to the small room she'd given me and stare at the wall. I couldn't cry anymore. I'd used up all my tears in Boston. I couldn't be angry. The rage had burned itself out. I just existed, hollow and numb, like a shell washed up on the beach with nothing living inside it. But slowly something strange happened. Mrs. Patterson never asked about the scandal, never mentioned Richard or the wedding or any of it. She just talked to me while we worked in the garden, about her late husband, about raising her 3 kids, about the neighborhood and how it had changed over the years. Normal things, human things. And gradually, I remembered what it felt like to be a person instead of a problem. She told me stories about my mother, things I never knew, how Jennifer had dreamed of being a teacher before she got pregnant, how she'd loved poetry, especially Mary Oliver, how she'd sing while doing dishes, this off-key humming that drove the neighbors crazy but that made her happy. My mother had been a person, not just a woman whose mistakes defined my entire existence. I got a job at the local library, shelving books and helping with the children's reading hour. It pays almost nothing, but nobody there cares about Boston scandals. They care about whether I can remember the Dewey Decimal System and if I'm patient with the 5-year-olds during story time. I've started taking classes at the community college, something I should have done years ago instead of dropping out when Richard told me to. Just general education credits for now, but maybe someday I'll figure out what I actually want to do with my life instead of what someone else has planned for me. But here's the real reason I'm writing, Evelyn. Because 3 weeks ago, something happened that I needed to share with you and Ethan. I was at the grocery store, buying bread and milk, when I saw him. Richard. He was standing in the produce section, examining avocados with that critical expression he always had, like even fruit had to meet his exacting standards. For a moment I froze. All the old fear came rushing back, the control, the threats, the years of manipulation. And then I realized he hadn't seen me, didn't recognize me in my jeans and flannel, with my hair pulled back and no makeup, looking like just another Portland local doing her shopping. I wasn't the groomed, polished daughter pawn he'd created. I was invisible to him. I could have walked away. Should have, probably. But instead, I approached him, stood right in front of him until he had to look at me. The recognition on his face was priceless. Shock, then calculation, then that smooth mask sliding into place. "Claire," he said, like we'd just run into each other at a cocktail party. "What a surprise. I didn't know you were in Portland." "You're not welcome here," I told him, and my voice didn't shake. "This is my city, my home. You don't get to take this from me, too." He started to speak, probably some rehearsed apology or manipulation, but I cut him off. "I know why you're here. You're looking for property to buy, trying to expand your fresh start to the West Coast. But Portland is small, Richard, and people here remember my mother. They remember how she struggled while some married lawyer in Boston sent barely enough money to keep us housed. They remember how she died without proper health care because she couldn't afford it." His face went pale, and I felt something shift inside me. Power. I had power over him for the first time in my entire life. "If you buy property here, if you try to establish yourself in this city, I'll tell everyone exactly who you are and what you've done. Not the sanitized version your PR team created, but the truth. Every detail, every contract, every threat, everything." He opened his mouth to argue, and I held up my hand. "I'm not the scared 24-year-old you controlled anymore. I'm not dependent on you. I don't need your money or your approval or your silence. You have no power over me now. So leave Portland. Leave me alone. Or I'll make sure you never rebuild your reputation anywhere." I walked away before he could respond, my heart pounding but my head held high. And Evelyn, here's the thing. He left. I checked. He canceled his appointments with real estate agents, checked out of his hotel 2 days early, and went back to Boston. Because for once in his manipulative life, he encountered someone who wasn't afraid of him anymore. I'm writing to tell you this because I want you and Ethan to know we survived him. The scandal tried to destroy us, but we're still here. We're damaged, yes. We're changed. We'll carry scars for the rest of our lives. But we're alive, and we're free, and he can't touch us anymore. I also want to ask your forgiveness for that scene at the Fairmont, for not being stronger sooner, for all the ways I let Richard use me to hurt you and Ethan. You deserved a better daughter-in-law, even if that relationship was built on lies. You deserved honesty, and I was too afraid to give it to you until it was almost too late. Tell Ethan. Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him that what we had was real, even if it was impossible. Tell him I hope he finds happiness with someone who isn't haunted by scandal and shame. He deserves that. You both do. I don't know if I'll ever come back to Boston. Maybe someday, when enough time has passed and I'm strong enough. But for now, I'm learning to build a life that belongs to me, learning what it means to make choices that aren't dictated by fear or control or someone else's manipulation. Thank you for believing me, for standing with me when it would have been easier to side with Richard, for choosing truth over comfort. I know it cost you everything. I hope someday it feels worth it. With gratitude and love, Claire. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. The first tears I'd cried in weeks that weren't from grief but from something else. Hope, maybe, or relief, or just the recognition that we were going to survive this after all. I called Ethan immediately. He'd moved back to his apartment in Cambridge, had started teaching again after MIT finally reinstated him following a review that found no misconduct. His voice when he answered sounded less hollow than it had in months. "Mom, everything okay?" "Better than okay," I said, and I heard the smile in my own voice for the first time in forever. "I got a letter from Claire. She's okay, Ethan. She's building a life." And she stood up to Richard. She won. I read him the letter over the phone, hearing his breathing change as I recounted Claire's confrontation with Richard in the grocery store. When I finished, there was a long silence. "She's braver than all of us," he finally said, and I could hear tears in his voice. "She lost everything and still found a way to fight back." "We all did," I corrected gently. "We all lost everything and fought back. That's what survivors do." That evening, I walked through Boston for the first time in months without feeling like I needed to hide. I walked down Newbury Street, past the expensive shops I used to frequent, past restaurants where I'd had countless lunches with women who no longer spoke to me. The magnolias were blooming in tiny yard gardens, their pink petals bright against the brick buildings. People passed me without recognition, without judgment, without knowing or caring who I was. I was just another woman walking through the city on a spring evening, anonymous, free. I thought about everything we'd lost, our reputations, our social standing, our comfortable illusions about family and loyalty. I thought about the price of truth and whether it had been worth paying. And I realized we'd lost everything that wasn't real, everything built on lies and manipulation and fear. What remained? Ethan's integrity, Claire's courage, my own refusal to be complicit anymore, was smaller and harder and more painful. But it was real. It was ours. And nobody could take it from us. The truth had cost us everything, but silence would have cost us ourselves. And in the end, that was the lesson Richard never learned. You can control people with fear and manipulation, but eventually, freedom becomes more valuable than comfort. Truth becomes more important than reputation. And the people you've used as pawns learn to become players. I walked home as the sun set over the Charles River, painting the water gold and pink, and I felt something I hadn't felt since that night at the cathedral. Peace. The end. So I ask you, as you sit there reflecting on everything you've just heard, what would you have done? If you discovered that your entire life had been built on lies, that the person you trusted most had been manipulating everyone you loved for decades, would you have chosen silence or truth? Would you have protected your reputation? Or would you have burned it all down to save your son's soul? Because that's the choice I faced on that cold December morning in Boston, and I chose truth. I chose devastation over complicity. And yes, it cost me everything, my marriage, my social standing, my comfortable illusions about family and love. But what I gained was something Richard could never take from me. The ability to look at myself in the mirror and recognize the woman staring back. The hardest lesson I've learned in 69 years is this. Sometimes love means letting everything fall apart. Sometimes protecting the people you care about means destroying the world you built together. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak the truth even when silence would be so much easier, so much safer, so much less painful. Richard thought he could control us all through fear and shame, through the threat of scandal and social ruin. But he forgot that there are things more powerful than reputation. Things like integrity, like courage, like a mother's fierce, unbreakable love for her child. In the end, he lost everything he actually cared about. His image, his respect, his power, while we kept the only things that truly mattered, ourselves. I don't know what happens next for me, for Ethan, for Claire. I don't know if we'll ever fully heal from the wounds Richard inflicted, if we'll ever stop carrying the scars of that night at the cathedral. But I do know this. We survived. We told the truth, and we're still standing. If my story resonates with you, if it made you think about the secrets hidden in your own family, about the price of silence and the cost of truth, then please follow this channel. Leave a like and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because somewhere out there is another person trapped by manipulation, another family built on lies, another survivor waiting to find the courage to speak. And maybe, just maybe, our story can help them find their voice.